I was camping in a valley by myself with no cell service. I stayed late on a trail and ran into a nice local guy as it was getting dark. He showed me a local camping spot close to the road and the river, but camouflaged. I had a fire, drank beer, and listened to my friend's comedy podcast. I was loud and visible. Because it was dark already, I decided to sleep in the back of my truck under my topper next to all of my gear as opposed to setting up my tent. The next morning, I made a fire, cracked a beer, and started making breakfast. I then noticed that there was a man at the edge of my camp. He comes closer, but never looks directly at me. This man looked homeless. He had a long, ratty beard and had at least 100 plastic grocery bags tied all over his clothes. I comment about how nice the day is. No response. I offer him breakfast. Nothing. He sort of paces around the perimeter of my camp. I offer him a beer, but he just turns around. The dude is just standing there, back to me, wandering around. I realized that there isn't going to be any good happenings. I had my bear spray and buck knife super close. I told him he can either acknowledge me or leave immediately. He ignores me. I grab the bear mace and walk a few steps towards him. He sulked away, and I threw my stuff in my truck and left that place as quickly as I could. I'd wonder if he had watched me during the night, and I thank my laziness for staying in my truck instead of a tent. Four friends and I had a long weekend off from school, and we decided to go camping in the North Georgia mountains. We packed a big 10-person tent and loaded up my buddy's truck. He and I had some experience being outdoorsmen, and he was an Army vet, so we packed really well and had all sorts of amenities like a propane stove, fold-up cots, and a portable shower. We were ready for the whole weekend. We left Wednesday afternoon and parked the truck in a small town and started hiking into the woods to find a spot. It was a fairly normal hike until we got about 4 or 5 miles in. The first time we noticed something strange was when we came into a little clearing in the woods with a tiny lake in it. We stepped into the open area and everything stopped. No birds chirping, no squirrels running around. Even the clouds and wind seemed to stop moving. My buddy and I both thought, well, there's got to be a predator nearby, and took out our handguns. I've never seen a bear in Georgia, so we figured it was a mountain lion or maybe some coyotes. My friend and I were looking around the edge of the clearing, and he grabbed me. He nodded across the water, and when I looked, I saw what seemed to be a woman standing just at the tree line. She was maybe 150 yards away. We assumed she must live somewhere nearby, and so we continued walking past the water and clearing. As we headed back into the woods, I looked over my shoulder at where she was standing, but she was gone. The sounds of the forest returned once we got into the trees. We made a campsite about 2 miles past that, as it was getting late and we didn't want to be stuck building camp in the dark. We got everything unpacked and set up and built a fire, popped a couple of beers, and sat down to hang out. There was a girl I was interested in on the trip, and we had been flirting, so after a few beers and the sun was down, we snuck away from the fire under the pretense that she wanted help setting up part of the tent. We started fooling around, and after a few minutes she stopped and looked at me funny. I asked what was wrong, and she said, "Nothing. It just got really quiet." We both quickly dressed and headed back outside to the fire. The others hadn't noticed anything strange and didn't mention anything wrong, except joking with us that it took us a long time to fix the tent. On the first morning, we found that the propane stove had been turned on, but not ignited, and had gone empty overnight. None of us had used it. The second morning, we noticed some things had gone missing. A lantern we left outside by the fire was gone. My crush's sweatshirt she left on the little folding chair. We figured we just misplaced things, or someone had used them and put them somewhere else. But they were just missing. During the second full day, we were looking for a waterfall that we read online was in the area. We were following the river upstream when everything went silent again. My buddy nudged me while we were walking and indicated up the top of the hill next to the river. I looked up through the trees and was just able to make out the figure of the same woman, same clothes and all, just standing there. I couldn't tell if she was looking at us or not, but she was just standing there. My buddy told the girls he thought he saw a mountain lion following us and was going to go scare it off. He hustled up the hill making a lot of noise and came back down about 10 minutes later. He said he scared it off to the girls, but told me aside that the woman wasn't there when he got up there. We put it out of our minds when we found the waterfall, as the girls decided to go skinny dipping in the river. Afterwards, we hiked back to camp and found it a mess. It wasn't totally trashed, but it was clear something had gotten into our stuff. We told the girls it was probably raccoons, but we went to bed with our guns that night. Later that evening, things went truly bizarre. I remember waking up because my crush was squeezing my arm. I opened my eyes and she hushed me before I could ask what was wrong. There was complete silence all around the tent. I looked across the tent and my buddy was sitting halfway up looking around. We both stayed awake for the next 2-ish hours before the sun started coming up, and we packed our stuff and we all headed out. The entire hike back into town was eerily silent. There were a couple points I thought I saw the woman through the trees, but never got a clear sight of her. We avoided the lake completely and got back to the truck in what seemed like half the time it took us to get out to the camp. After we were safely on the road back home, the girls and my buddy all started to tell everyone about moments they thought they heard or saw the woman all weekend, but were too freaked out to mention it out loud, like she would go away if we ignored her. The crazy part was, none of us could describe her face. It's almost like it was blurry. We have no idea who she was, but I've never been camping or hiking at night since. This isn't exactly a camping story. I used to live in a very small town when I worked for my laptop, like population 200 small. I was in a small cabin in the woods, though next to the highway. One day, I was walking my dog and heard 2 gunshots somewhere nearby. I didn't think much of it. It's a hunting area, and it's kinda redneck. The next day, or the day after, a truck pulls up. I don't even know anyone in this town, so it's weird, and I'm put off. The guy calls me over and says he's my neighbor. He asked if I heard the shots, and I told him I did. He claims it was his neighbor taking pot shots at his house over a land dispute. He doesn't ask me to be a witness for him or anything like that, just if I heard. Okay, this seems really odd to me. I never met this guy before, and when I say neighbor, I mean about a kilometer away and out of sight. The guy sees my dog digging somewhere unimportant, and all of a sudden starts telling me to tell her not to do that. He gets out, and she's iffy on him. He says, "Here, watch," and calls her over. He grabs her and tries to do that stupid Cesar Millan dominance, holding the dog on the back of their neck for really no reason. She starts yelping, and I tell him to stop. He asks me whether I have any guns myself, and I say no. He says that he's a great dog trainer, and asks me to go over and mow his lawn. and to please ensure to bring my dog. I can't describe it, but his mannerisms and the way he talked was just plain creepy, especially that line. He leaves soon after, and I'm stuck thinking, I just told this guy not only that I heard the gunshots, but that I'm unarmed here. How do I even know it was his neighbor like he claimed, and not, in fact, that this weird dude has shot someone at his house and is trying to see who would have heard or witnessed it? I wouldn't go to his house, not a chance. Then he kept showing up, asking why, calling and texting and asking why. I gave him my number before realizing how weird he was, but he was really adamant I go over there. Turns out the guy is a total alkie. He lost his wife, his job, everything, and he's in a very dangerous mental state. Nothing to lose. The small store owners in town explained the guy to me. He's apparently the most hated guy in the valley. Bad reputation and all. I'm now really freaked out. I found it very hard to sleep after that. Cabin in the woods, nobody nearby that would hear any commotion, ample angles for the place to be approached from the woods, and just a can of bear spray and a knife. And the guy knows I have no guns. I would be kept up for hours listening at night for any movement outside, as it was dead silent there. In the middle of the night one night, my dog starts to growl, then growls more. I don't hear anything, but it didn't matter. Every room in that cabin had a window but the bathroom. I just got up, grabbed the knife and bear spray, and locked myself in that bathroom for hours, listening. I think I eventually fell asleep in there. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of dread. I just pictured this lunatic sneaking up with a shotgun to take me out, for maybe having heard him murder someone with a gun days earlier. It was awful. I moved, but unfortunately the new landlords were equally creepy, and even tried stealing my dog, even though they had 3. Literally, I heard them discussing it, how they had to make themselves the in crowd so that she'd want to be with them, and hand-feeding her dog food when they thought I wasn't looking. It must have just been the small town thing, totally strange people in that town for the most part. They went to the market one morning. I packed all of my stuff into my uninsured van with no license and my pup, and just bailed that town and never looked back. I work as a counselor at a summer camp in Southern California. The place is very out in the woods, so we get all sorts of animals wandering through, from deer and foxes, coyotes howling in the distance, to a mountain lion that's been spotted in the area. The camp also has a very spiritual or haunted vibe to it. There are a couple creepy and weird spots, some things in the area that we think show the place has been inhabited in the past and stuff like that. One night, after putting my kids to bed, I was standing outside our cabin talking to another counselor when my friend Sadie comes running by with her entire teenage girls' cabin, maybe 12 of them, all dressed in black and freaking out. She screams at me that she thought they heard a ghost, and once her kids were asleep, she'd meet me back here to explain and investigate. Sadie is normally the level-headed type, not to freak out easily, so this really caught my attention. She meets me back by my cabin maybe 30 minutes later and explains what was going on. She took her campers on a night hike, had them all dress up in black, and pretend to be ninjas. All was fun until on their way back, they passed an especially dark part of the trail when they heard off in the distance, just beyond the tree line, what sounded like a faint help from a small child. But each time they heard it, it got more and more distorted until it no longer sounded human, yet still sounded like a child yelling help in the distance. Naturally, they freaked out and ran. Sadie and I decided to be good counselors and go investigate the sound of a small child yelling help. As we walk over to the area of the trail, we hear it. It didn't sound like a small child anymore. It sounded like a demon screeching out its best impression of a child, and it didn't sound like it was coming from any point source, but more was coming from an entire mountainside. We booked it back to the safety of the main part of the camp, where we tell this story to anyone who will listen. The next day, the camp director had a meeting where they told us to tell our campers not to freak out and that it was the bobcat in the forest. They are harmless and do make a high-pitched yelping sound at night. But this was no bobcat. I went on a group camping trip in the middle of nowhere out in Arizona. Our first night, I was awoken to what sounded like sniffing outside our tent. My immediate reaction was that it was likely a bear or some animal that came across our site, and just maybe my idiot friends didn't tie up the garbage. Seconds later, I can hear the sniffing going to the tent next to ours, and everyone in mine grabs one another quietly to acknowledge we were all awake and were aware of what's happening outside. Moments later, a friend in another tent popped out and started to scream and make noise. He had a gun too, hoping it would scare off whatever animal was in our sight. Turns out, it wasn't an animal at all. It was some guy who had gone through our coolers and food and also decided it'd be okay to sniff our tents. Our friends chased him off, and we immediately packed up and left. About a year later, my friends and I decided to return to a nearby area, thinking what we encountered was a one-time incident. This time, we thought we'd outsmart any possible creepers, and instead of camping in our tents, we all slept in the beds of our trucks and SUVs. 'Cause, they can't possibly sniff a Toyota Tacoma. Anyways, it's the middle of the night. I'm passed out in the back of my SUV when I suddenly feel a bright light on my face. Naturally, I would have woken up, cussed, and asked who was doing that. However, I instantly knew to pretend to be asleep and not let the individual know I was awake. I laid there next to my girlfriend, hoping she would do the same as I, and I kept an ear out for any unusual sounds, like sniffing. All I could hear was a friend snoring by the campfire. After the light left my car, I heard the person walk to the next truck and shine his light on my friends in there. I slowly looked up, and it ended up being an older guy, just standing there staring at everyone while they slept. I waited until he left the campsite, and I busted my ass out of that truck and woke up my friends, most of which had also been pretending to sleep and realized what was going on. I don't know if he was a park ranger or just some creep, but I do know that we will never be returning there ever again.